Hello everybody and welcome to this presentation of the Elder Scrolls lore. It's time to take a closer look at one of Tamriel's main players. This is a race who has maintained an economic and political standing on Tamriel for all of recorded history, the Khajiit. On the surface, the Khajiit are very easy to understand. They're cat people. They're nimble, they're cunning, they're fond of boxes. They're cat people. Plain and simple, right? Well, yes, but as with everything else in the lore of the Elder Scrolls, once you get through the surface, you'll find so much more. Physically speaking, there is an enormous amount of variety among the Khajiit. There are the Cathay, Doggy, Palmer, and Suthay forms, all of whom resemble human-cat hybrids to a varying degree. Then there are the Sench, who are much larger and walk on 4 legs. They are commonly employed as steeds and have been referred to as battle cats by Imperial troops, which is pretty awesome. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you've got the Alfiq, who are about the size of house cats. It's rumored that even though they can't speak, they can perfectly understand spoken language. It's also been reported that they are proficient spellcasters, which is pretty awesome. Perhaps the strangest of all are the Ohms, who, were it not for their tails and facial tattoos, might be easily mistaken for Bosmer. Due to this striking resemblance, it's been theorized that the Ohms are descended from the original Aldmer, possibly the result of crossbreeding between species. However, that idea doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. You'll see why in a bit. There is also the Toje variety, of which basically nothing is known except that they live in the jungle. Putting Rot at the end of each variety denotes a physically larger version, each considered a separate, distinct form of Khajiit. To understand how and why there are so many different types of Khajiit, you need to know a little bit about the Khajiit gods. The Khajiit pantheon, like most in Tamriel, is mainly made up of an assortment of divines and Daedra by different names. In addition to this ensemble, the Khajiit have the Jah-Khaje, also known as the Lunar Lattice. Tamriel's moons, Masser and Secunda, are referred to as the gods Joan and Jode by the Khajiit, and are considered aspects of the Jah-Khaje. According to the Khajiit, during the time of Nirn's creation, when Lorkhan's heart was removed, his body was hurled toward the moons and stopped there. It became the Dead Moon, which is hidden from view and ties the lunar lattice together, endowing the moons with incredible divine power. The power of the lunar lattice is what is responsible for the many forms of the Khajiit. The phases of Masser and Secunda at the time of each Khajiit's birth are what determines the form they will take. This sounds bizarre, but remember that Lorkhan's heart holds a gargantuan amount of power itself. Its power has been used to create living gods, and it made an entire race disappear from the face of existence. While the remainder of Lorkhan's body may not be as powerful as his heart, it's not much of a stretch to accept this idea that it can empower the moons in such a way as to influence the physical form of mortal beings. All Khajiit are born the same, and eventually develop into their mature size and shape. This would explain how a tiny little Alfiq could give birth to an enormous Sench. This apparently does happen, which is why the idea that the Ohms are descendants of the Aldmer doesn't really hold water. A Khajiit's physiology is determined by the moons, not genetics. Plus, I couldn't find a single in-game or otherwise official source that outright claims there is a link between the Aldmer and the Khajiit. Merely the suggestion that some believe that to be the case is all there is. And even that goes on to say that this opinion is not held by the majority of people. To help counter this theory, we have the account of Topal the Pilot, the earliest known Aldmer explorer of Tamriel's mainland. On his way up the Niben River, he describes encountering cat demons of 4 legs and 2, which are clearly meant to be ancient Khajiit. There is also evidence that not only did the Khajiit exist prior to the Aldmer expansion from Somerset, but that they had already established a merchant society, with trade caravans traveling the breadth of southern Tamriel. So, are the Khajiit direct descendants of the Aldmer? That is a definitive no. Could the Ohms Khajiit be distant relatives of the Aldmer? Maybe, but if you accept the whole lunar lattice thing, then no. The moons are a central theme of Khajiit culture. Each phase of the moons has a patron deity associated with it, and the symbols of the crescent and circle are prevalent in Khajiit art and iconography. The most prevalent example of this devotion to the moons comes in the form of moon sugar. It is said that the light of the moons is absorbed by the Topal Sea, and is then washed ashore to the Tenmar forest, where moon sugar grows. It is therefore believed by the Khajiit that moon sugar is crystallized moonlight. Remember that the moons are gods to the Khajiit, so ingesting moon sugar is akin to absorbing the essence of the gods. In fact, the word sugar seems to sometimes be used as a synonym for spirit in Khajiit speech. Suffice it to say that moon sugar is kind of a big deal. Its refined form, skooma, on the other hand, is a dangerous and highly addictive drug. Walk through the streets of any Khajiit city and you'll find skooma addicts, perpetually shifting back and forth between states of ecstasy and lethargy. Despite this ugly side, moon sugar is an essential and revered component of the Khajiit way of life. Khajiiti cuisine abounds with sugary sweets, as well as other recipes which use actual moon sugar. And despite the substances being illegal almost everywhere, moon sugar and skooma remain the Khajiit's chief exports. Senchel and Torval aren't the only cities in Tamriel in which you'll find skooma addicts. The Khajiit are a very spiritual people. As such, they have a spiritual leader, known as the Main. The process of selecting or becoming the Main isn't precisely spelled out, but there are two components we know of. One is that the Main is born during a specific alignment of the lunar lattice, where the dead moon is in full view. Since no species other than the Khajiit can corroborate the existence of the dead moon, this would have to be some cosmic event that Khajiit priests can somehow sense or predict. Then, when it's time for a new Main to be selected, the qualifying candidates must embark on a dangerous quest to the surface of the moons. The one who returns is the one who attains the title. The prospect of this quest to the moons is dismissed as pure nonsense by Imperial scholars. However, this is clearly meant as a metaphor for a spiritual journey. Since the moons are considered gods, the quest to the moons may involve some grueling challenge which can't be met by the average Khajiit. In doing so, the one who is capable of completing the journey touches the gods, so to speak. This would be such an accomplishment as to make one worthy of the title of Main, the spiritual guide for all Khajiit. The Main is purely a religious figure and wields no official political power whatsoever. However, the Main's words hold tremendous weight, and they may take it upon themselves to render judgment in times of crisis. The Khajiit hail from the land of Elsewhere, but of course it's not quite that simple. The land wasn't always called Elsewhere, and the Khajiit weren't always a unified people, nor would they always remain so. At the beginning of the First Era, where reliable recorded history begins, the Khajiit were made up of 16 independent kingdoms. You might expect that they would be in constant struggle with each other, competing over land and resources, but you couldn't be more wrong. This loose confederation of independent territories was actually quite harmonious. Each territory had a specialty. A northern kingdom may specialize in the training of warriors, whereas a coastal one would primarily focus on fishing and seafaring. Territories would freely trade goods and services with each other, giving and taking whatever they needed in equal measure. It is said that the balance of political power in this relationship was determined by, what else, the moons. Power would shift from one kingdom to the next based on which phase the moons were in. Beyond that, we don't know any specific details of this arrangement. It just worked. Khajiit society remained perfectly stable in this fashion for thousands of years. In the year 2260 of the First Era, everything changed with the arrival of the Thracian Plague. To make a long story short, the disease originated in the nation of Thrace, an archipelago situated roughly northwest of Somerset, and was a deliberate creation by the Slode. This biological attack on Tamriel will be covered in greater detail at a later date. For now, suffice it to say that its impact on the Khajiit was devastating. Khajiiti trade caravans facilitated the spread of the disease to every corner of every region. populations everywhere were decimated. Entire territories were either wiped out or left so crippled by the disease that they had no choice other than to be absorbed by a neighboring kingdom. When the plague passed, the 16 states of the Khajiits had been reduced to only 2. These were the kingdoms of Palatine and Ni-Kin-Al, better known as Palatine and Anakina. Unfortunately, the era of peaceful stability through cooperation was over. Anakina in the desert badlands of the north had developed a tribal nomadic culture, which surely helped them survive the harsh environment. Palatine, on the other hand, had control of the jungles, the coastline, and most importantly, the moon sugar. This afforded them a lavish lifestyle supported by booming international trade. This vast difference in culture between the two kingdoms resulted in centuries of animosity and conflict. They were constantly at war, with neither side ever gaining appreciable ground. Palatine had the riches necessary to hire as many mercenaries as they would ever need, and Anakina's world-class warriors were a match to any force they came up against. It was a bloody stalemate. In the year 309 of the Second Era, the two kingdoms united with the marriage of Kiergo of Anakina and Ashita of Palatine. The two rulers recognized the significance of this historic pact and renamed their new unified nation Elsewhere. The exact source of inspiration for the name is a subject of mild debate. A popular theory is that they drew from a Khajiit proverb, that a perfect society is always found elsewhere. This would make the name quite an optimistic choice, with just a hint of irony. I like it. This union of nations did not translate to a union of the Khajiit people. The populations of both former nations felt the unification to be a betrayal. Soon, the new noble class of Elsewhere found themselves besieged by an insurrection, which gave way to all-out rebellion. Kiergo petitioned the Empire of Cyrodiil for help, but the potentate Versailles had only recently been assassinated. They were in no shape to lend assistance. The situation seemed utterly hopeless until the intervention of the Main, Rid Tahar Radada. By his decree, all classes of Khajiit were made equal by establishing a system where the base of power shifted in accordance with, what else, the phases of the moons. In essence, control of Elsewhere would alternate between the desert chieftains and the city-dwelling nobility. This edict would be known as the Riddlethar. The Main's judgment was accepted by all, and peace was restored. In the interest of time, we're going to fast forward through the next 1,000 years or so. Between the years 560 and 601 of the Second Era, the Khanate flu broke out, originating in Blackmarsh. Though not as disastrous as the Thracian plague, it killed a significant number of Khajiit. The city of Senchel was the first hit and suffered the worst, as portions of it were burned down in an effort to cleanse the city of the disease. Khajiit society was on the brink of being upended yet again, when the Aldmer intervened. With their assistance, the Khanate flu was fought off. The Aldmer did not save the Khajiit out of charity, however. The Aldmeri Dominion needed allies, and Khajiit claws are very handy on the battlefield. In the year 394 of the Third Era, the 5 Years' War was fought between Elsewhere and Valenwood. The Bosmer claim it was retaliation for Khajiiti raids on Bosmer trade caravans. Elsewhere won, and gained a moderate increase in territory. At some point late in the Third Era, Elsewhere was absorbed into the Cyrodiilic Empire. Some Khajiit instigated minor rebellions against the Empire here and there, but nothing of consequence. There was a territorial dispute between Elsewhere and Leyawiin. Before things got ugly, a compromise was made between the Count of Leyawiin and the Main, mediated by the Emperor. Some Khajiit rejected the truce and continued to harass Leyawiin, but it never significantly escalated. And now we're approaching current events. In the year 98 of the Fourth Era, Masser and Secunda disappeared from the sky. The moons remained absent for 2 years. This period would be known as the Void Nights. We can only imagine the utter turmoil that this caused for the Khajiit, what with the moons being woven into every facet of their culture and society. When the moons came back, the Thalmor of the Aldmeri Dominion, who had had a major resurgence in the wake of the Oblivion Crisis, claimed that they were responsible for their return. It isn't clear whether the Thalmor actually brought the moons back or simply took advantage of the situation. Regardless, the Khajiit credited the Thalmor as their saviors. In the year 115 of the Fourth Era, a Thalmor-sponsored coup overthrew the Empire's control of Elsewhere. The nation was dissolved, and the kingdoms of Palatine and Anakina were re-established as client states of the Aldmeri Dominion. That is how things currently stand for the Khajiit, and that is where our story ends, at least for now. We have been on quite the journey. We've explored most of what there is to know about the Khajiit, all the way from the beginning of recorded history to some of the most recent history we have. As to the future of the Khajiit, if it is only half as rich as their past, we have a lot to look forward to. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you on the next presentation of the Elder Scrolls lore.